All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're going to completely flip how you look at your kitchen pantry. We're tracing the epic 5,000-year history of spices. And honestly, by the end of this, you might never look at that dusty little glass shaker of black pepper the exact same way again.
Think about this for a second. What happens if you accidentally spill a spoonful of black pepper across your kitchen counter today? You probably just grab a damp paper towel, wipe it into the trash, and literally don't think twice about it, right? But consider the stark contrast here. If you spilled that exact same pinch of pepper back in the year 1400, you would be absolutely devastated. You'd be down on your hands and knees trying to save it, because in that era, black pepper was worth more than its weight in pure silver. For the vast majority of recorded human history, spices weren't just fun little flavorings, they were the literal engine of global civilization.
So, let's start at the beginning with Section 1, the ancient value of spice. This story actually takes us all the way back to 1881, when archaeologists were carefully unwrapping the mummy of the legendary Pharaoh Ramses II, who died way back in 1213 BCE. And deep inside his nostrils, they found something shocking: dried black peppercorns. Now, why is that such a big deal? Well, because black pepper does not grow in Egypt. In fact, it doesn't grow anywhere in Africa or the Middle East. At that time, it grew exclusively in the lush tropical rainforests of southwestern India. So this staggering discovery proves that over 3,000 years ago, an incredibly complex, massive global trade network already existed just to move a fragile little berry from India across oceans and deserts, simply to place it inside the nose of an Egyptian king.
Which brings us to Section 2, Monsters, Myths, and Monopolies.
Now, because these botanical treasures were so incredibly valuable, they inspired some of the greatest and, honestly, most hilarious marketing lies in human history. See, for centuries, the Western world had absolutely no idea where their spices actually came from. If you asked an ancient Greek where to find cinnamon, they wouldn't point to a map of Sri Lanka. They'd tell you a terrifying story about monsters. We actually have this wild quote from the ancient Greek historian Herodotus. He wrote that cinnamon was harvested by giant, ferocious birds, building nests on sheer mountain cliffs, using thick sticks of sweet-smelling cinnamon. To get it, hunters supposedly had to leave massive, heavy chunks of ox meat at the bottom of the cliffs. The greedy birds would carry the meat up, the nests would snap under the sheer weight, and the hunters would grab the cinnamon from the wreckage. Where do these outrageous stories come from? Arab merchants. They brilliantly invented these terrifying myths of giant birds and flying vipers to protect their secret trade routes, scare off competitors, and justify the absolutely astronomical prices they were charging the Greeks and Romans. It was pure genius marketing.
Eventually, the Romans did crack the code. They discovered the monsoon winds, which allowed them to sail directly to India. But man, did it come at a massive cost. The Roman statesman Pliny the Elder was absolutely furious about this. He wrote, "India, China, and the Arabian Peninsula drain our empire of 100 million sesterces every single year for a berry whose only desirable quality is pungency. It literally drained their gold reserves." And this obsession, it didn't fade. Centuries later, in 408 CE, when Alaric the Visigoth laid siege to Rome, his exact ransom to spare the city included thousands of pounds of gold, silver, and 3,000 pounds of black pepper.
Jumping forward to the Middle Ages, we absolutely have to bust a huge myth right here. You've probably heard the story that medieval Europeans used heavy spices to cover up the taste of rotting meat because, they didn't have refrigerators. Well, that is completely false, and the undeniable economics prove it. If you could afford a pound of nutmeg, which at the time could buy you a team of draft horses or even a small estate, you could definitely afford fresh meat. You wouldn't waste a literal fortune trying to choke down spoiled food. The reality of wealth was much simpler. Covering your food in obscenely expensive spices was basically the medieval equivalent of parking a fleet of supercars outside a mansion. It was all about showing off your immense riches and power to your banquet guests. This massive demand leads us perfectly into Section 3, the desperate age of discovery. So, when the Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople in 1453, they basically slammed the door shut on Europe's primary spice trade routes, creating a massive economic bottleneck. And this sparked a desperate, high-stakes race across uncharted oceans. It's wild to see how quickly this escalated. Portugal decided to go south. By 1488, Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and by 1498, Vasco da Gama successfully reached India, returning with a cargo of spices that yielded a completely insane 6,000% profit. But look at 1492. Spain made a completely different, frankly reckless gamble. Christopher Columbus sailed west, totally underestimating the size of the earth. He accidentally opened up the New World while blindly searching for Indian black pepper. In fact, he was so desperate to prove he'd found the spice routes that when he tasted a fiery indigenous fruit in the Caribbean, he just declared it was pepper. And that's exactly why we still confusingly call chili peppers peppers today.
Let's move into our fourth chapter, the bloody Nutmeg Empire.
We're leaving pepper behind for a minute and heading deep into the remote Maluku Islands. $7 trillion. That is the staggering modern estimated valuation of the Dutch VOC, the United East India Company. Created in 1602, it was the world's very first multinational megacorporation. And this unimaginable wealth was built almost entirely on one single objective: establishing total, merciless global control over the clove and nutmeg markets.
See, nutmeg only grew in one microscopic spot on the entire planet, the Banda Islands. And when the indigenous Bondonese people refused to accept absurdly low, fixed prices for their crops, the Dutch took horrific action. In 1621, Governor-General Jan Pietersen Koen carried out a calculated genocide. The VOC brought in mercenaries, systematically burned villages, and executed the village elders. Before the Dutch arrived, the population was 15,000. When it was all over, there were just 1,000 survivors left. The Dutch then brought in enslaved people to harvest the nutmeg, maintaining an artificial global monopoly that was quite literally soaked in blood.
To really grasp the absolute madness of this monopoly, just look at how it physically rewired the map of the world. The British managed to hold on to one single tiny 2-mile speck of nutmeg-producing land in the archipelago called the Island of Run. Well, in 1667, the Dutch wanted total unbroken control so badly, they offered the British a trade. In exchange for the tiny island of Run, the Dutch gave the British a cold, marshy, relatively unimportant fur trading outpost in North America. That outpost was called New Amsterdam. The British accepted and promptly renamed it New York. That's right, literally every skyscraper in Manhattan today stands on land that was traded away just to secure a handful of nutmeg trees.
All right, Section 5, stealing the world's flavors. These completely airtight, violent global monopolies didn't last forever. They were actually broken by botanical pirates and brilliant unsung heroes. This brings us to a Frenchman with one of the most wonderfully ironic names in all of history, Pierre Poivre. He was a one-armed botanical pirate who basically realized that plants don't belong to corporations, they belong to the earth. In 1770, he organized these covert maritime missions, sneaking past Dutch naval patrols in the dead of night, to successfully steal live nutmeg and clove saplings, which he then planted in French tropical colonies. His daring heist completely shattered the Dutch monopoly. And hey, if his name sounds a bit familiar, it translates to Peter Pepper. He is the literal inspiration for the famous nursery rhyme, Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers.
Now, while Europe was busy stealing nutmeg, the New World had its very own botanical mystery going on, and that was vanilla. Vanilla is a delicate Mexican orchid. For 300 years, European botanists planted it in their colonies all over the world, but it never produced a single vanilla bean. They were completely baffled. What they didn't realize is that the vanilla flower is a biological fortress. It only opens for a few hours a year and had co-evolved exclusively with a tiny stingless Mexican insect called the Melipona bee. Without that specific bee, the plant was trapped, giving Mexico a massive 300-year global monopoly. And the person who finally cracked this 300-year-old scientific riddle wasn't some fancy European professor. It was actually a 12-year-old enslaved boy named Edmund Albius, living on the island of Réunion in 1841. He possessed this extraordinary botanical brilliance. He figured out a lightning-fast surgical technique. Step 1. Gently lift the tiny protective flap inside the orchid with a sliver of bamboo. Step 2, press the pollen against the stigma with your thumb. It took like 5 seconds. Edmund revolutionized the global vanilla industry almost overnight. Tragically, he died in poverty, never seeing a penny for his genius. But even today, practically every single real vanilla bean produced on Earth is still pollinated by hand using the exact same bamboo stick method invented by this 12-year-old boy. So if we look at a comparison of these plants, a really stark contrast starts to emerge. While vanilla requires meticulous hand pollination and nutmeg demands highly specific volcanic soil, the chili pepper is entirely different. It is an incredibly resilient, fast-growing weed. You drop a seed in almost any soil, and just 3 months later, you've got an overflowing bush of spicy peppers. Because it was so biologically adaptable, the chili pepper managed to aggressively conquer the globe almost overnight, traveling from the Americas to India to China and across Africa in just a few short generations. And because it was so easy to grow, chilies offered something completely revolutionary: the ultimate democratization of flavor. For practically zero cost, billions of working-class people suddenly had access to an intense, addictive sensation. The chemical capsaicin binds to your TRPV1 pain receptors, basically telling your brain your mouth is on fire. Your brain responds by releasing a massive flood of endorphins and dopamine, painkillers and pleasure chemicals that create a mild euphoric high. Chilies took plain, starchy diets and turned them into vibrant, exciting feasts, proving once and for all that the thrill of spice no longer belonged exclusively to kings and emperors. Which brings us to our final chapter, Section 6, Foundations of the Modern Economy. Let's tie all of this together, because these tiny, seemingly insignificant plants literally wired our modern, interconnected world. The high-stakes, desperate hunt for spices built the foundational financial institutions we rely on today. Joint stock corporations were invented just to fund these risky spice voyages. The world's first official stock market in Amsterdam, created specifically to trade shares of the Dutch VOC. Maritime insurance, limited liability, and the very concept of global, interconnected supply chains were all forged on the wooden decks of spice galleons. But we also have to acknowledge the immense, brutal human cost here. This trade pioneered the exact blueprint for industrial-scale colonial exploitation, slavery, and monopoly control that later empires would use for sugar, cotton, and tea.
So that leaves us with a final thought to ponder. Today, spices sit quietly in small glass jars in your local supermarket, costing only a couple of bucks. They've become entirely ordinary. But when you shake that pepper over your plate tonight, I want you to ask yourself, what are you truly tasting? Is it just a mundane ingredient? Or are you taking part in a 5,000-year-old ritual, tasting the blood, the daring ambition, the tragedy, and the brilliant genius of the human journey? The next time you open your pantry, remember, you are holding the epic history of the world right in the palm of your hand.
Please like and subscribe.